My name is Odalis Marchetti, and for 9 years I ran my father-in-law's kitchen the way you run something you actually love. Before dawn, after close, through 2 hospitalizations and 1 flood that nearly took the walk-in freezer with it. I did it while my husband, Nico, gambled away enough of our savings that I stopped telling him the real numbers on our bank statements, because watching his face fall had stopped changing anything a long time ago. Salvatore never once called me an employee. He called me his right hand. He said it at every holiday table, every anniversary of the restaurant's opening, every time a customer asked who was really behind the osso buco that had made Marchetti's a name people drove an hour to taste. I believed him. I built 9 years of my life around believing him. He died on a Tuesday in March, and the will was read 4 days later in a lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. Salvatore left the restaurant entirely to his son Dominic, my brother-in-law, who hadn't set foot in that kitchen in over a decade, who couldn't tell you the difference between a bechamel and a veloute if his life depended on it. My name wasn't mentioned once. I sat through the funeral 3 days later with my hands folded in my lap, the way I'd learned to sit through disappointment long before I ever wore this family's last name. Dominic found me near the coat check, still in his black suit, and told me, almost gently, that my services would no longer be needed, starting Monday. I thanked him for his time. Then I drove straight to the county records office before it closed, because there was one document Salvatore had signed 9 years ago that Dominic had clearly never bothered to read. The county records office closed at 5, and I pulled into the lot at 4:41, with my funeral dress still on, my heels sinking slightly into gravel that hadn't been repaved since I first started working at Marchetti's. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I hadn't cried yet. Not at the will reading, not at the funeral, not when Dominic said the word services, like I was a vendor he was choosing not to renew. I filed that away, the way I filed most things those days, and walked inside. I want to explain why the records office, of all places, and why I knew exactly what I was looking for. 9 years earlier, when Salvatore first asked me to take over the kitchen full-time, the restaurant had been drowning. His original chef had walked out over a pay dispute, the health inspector had flagged 3 violations in 1 visit, and Nico, my husband, Salvatore's younger son, had already made it clear he had no interest in the family business beyond collecting a modest monthly draw from it. I was 28, newly married, and terrified in the particular way you're terrified when you love something enough to be afraid of failing it. Salvatore came to me himself, not through Nico, and asked if I'd run the kitchen, not manage it. Run it, sourcing, staffing, the recipes his own mother had brought over from Calabria, all of it. I said yes on one condition, because even then, some instinct in me understood what I was worth, and refused to let it go unrecorded. I told him I needed something in writing, not a title, not a raise, though the raise came too, eventually. I needed my name on the business in some form, because I had already watched enough of Nico's promises evaporate to know that verbal trust, however warmly delivered, disappears the moment the person offering it is no longer in the room to honor it. Salvatore hadn't argued. He respected boundaries drawn out of self-respect rather than suspicion. It was one of the things I genuinely loved about him. He'd had his lawyer draft a simple operating agreement for Marchetti's LLC, one that named me as a 10% equity holder in the business itself, separate from the will, separate from anything that could be undone by a single afternoon in a lawyer's office 4 days after his death. I remembered signing it in his cramped office above the kitchen, the smell of garlic and simmering tomatoes drifting up through the floorboards, Salvatore pouring us both a small glass of his cousin's homemade wine to market. 10% isn't much, he'd said, but it's real. Nobody can pretend it isn't there. I hadn't thought about that document in years, not because I'd forgotten it, but because I never imagined I'd need to prove it existed. Salvatore had always treated me like family, and I had let myself believe, the way you let yourself believe in things you desperately want to be permanent, that the paperwork was a formality rather than a lifeline. Standing in that records office, watching a clerk pull the filing from a decade-old microfiche archive because Marchetti's had never bothered digitizing anything that old, I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite anger. It was closer to the feeling of finding solid ground after believing, for 4 days, that you'd been standing on nothing at all. The document was there, Filed, notarized, exactly where it should have been, 10% equity in Marchetti's LLC, held by Odalise Marchetti, dated 9 years earlier, signed by Salvatore Marchetti, in his own careful hand. Dominic had inherited a restaurant. He had not inherited all of it. I made a copy of the filing before the office closed, my hands steady in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd watched me nod politely at that funeral an hour earlier. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long moment afterward, the copy resting on the passenger seat like something fragile, and I thought about Monday, about the kitchen I had built with my own hands for 9 years, about a brother-in-law who thought he'd just closed a door I had no way of reopening. I thought about calling my lawyer that night. Then my phone buzzed in my lap, an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately, one I hadn't expected to hear from so soon after the funeral. Dominic. I let it ring twice before I answered, the way I'd trained myself to do with anything that demanded a reaction I hadn't yet decided how to give. Odalise. Dominic's voice had the particular brightness of a man trying to sound generous about something he didn't actually feel generous about. I wanted to call before Monday. I know today was a lot, for both of us. It was, I said, and left it there. I've been thinking, he continued, and I want you to know, there's no hard feelings in any of this. The restaurant needs a different direction now. Dad ran it his way for 40 years, and I think it's time it modernized a little. New menu, maybe a rebrand. I've already had a consultant look at the space. He paused, and I could hear him deciding how to phrase the next part. I just don't think your role fits where I'm taking it. I thought about 9 years of 4 a.m. deliveries, of teaching 2 generations of line cooks how to properly reduce a sauce, of the Christmas Eve Salvatore had a mild heart scare, and I ran service alone for 6 hours without telling a single customer anything was wrong, because the restaurant mattered more to me that night than my own fear did. I understand, I said, because I did understand, just not in the way he meant it. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Dominic said, and there was real relief in his voice, the relief of a man who'd expected a harder conversation and was pleasantly surprised to be spared one. Dad always said you were practical. I respect that. I almost laughed. Practical was one word for it. I said nothing. I'll have your final check ready Monday, he added. And listen, if you ever want a reference, I'm happy to write one. You really did keep that kitchen running all those years. I mean that. I thanked him again, the same measured thanks I'd given him at the funeral, and I hung up before he could hear whatever was moving underneath my voice, because I still wasn't entirely sure myself what it was. I didn't call my lawyer that night. I sat with the copy of the equity filing on my kitchen counter instead, next to a stack of unopened condolence cards, and I let myself finally cry, not for Dominic's dismissal, and not even entirely for Salvatore, but for the particular grief of realizing how easily 9 years of my life had almost been erased by a single conversation in a coat check. The next morning, I called Priscilla Okafor, an attorney I'd used twice before for minor business contracts, when Salvatore was still negotiating supplier deals. I told her everything: the will, the funeral, Dominic's phone call, the filing I'd found. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. 10% equity, properly filed and notarized 9 years ago, is not something a will can simply override, she said. A will controls what a person owns outright at the time of death. It doesn't control what they'd already transferred away while they were alive. If this filing is legitimate, and it sounds like it is, you're not an employee Dominic can dismiss. You're a co-owner he doesn't know he has. So what happens now? I asked. Now, Priscilla said, we need to understand exactly what Dominic actually inherited, because if Salvatore's will left him the restaurant without specifying the LLC's full ownership structure, there's a real possibility the estate's lawyer either didn't know about your equity stake, or knew and left it out entirely. Her voice sharpened slightly. I want to pull the LLC's full filing history before we do anything else. I want to know if there were any changes made to that ownership structure in the past year. People don't usually forget a filing like this by accident, Odalise. Sometimes they forget it very deliberately. 2 days later, Priscilla called me back, and I could hear, even before she said a word, that whatever she'd found had unsettled her. I need you to come into the office, she said. There's an amendment filed to the LLC 8 months ago. I don't think Salvatore knew about it. And I don't think you're going to like whose signature is on it. Priscilla's office smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner, and she had the amendment already laid out on the table between us when I arrived, a single page that looked deceptively unremarkable for something that had clearly kept her up analyzing it the night before. 8 months ago, she said, someone filed an amendment to Marchetti's LLC operating agreement. It restructured the equity distribution. She slid the page toward me. It doesn't remove your 10% outright. That would have required your signature, and there isn't one here, but it does something almost as damaging. It creates a new class of shares, issued specifically to cover operational advances, and it authorizes the managing member to issue those new shares without requiring approval from minority equity holders. I stared at the page, trying to make sense of language that seemed designed to be misunderstood. In plain terms, I said, what does that mean for me? In plain terms, Priscilla said, it means someone gave themselves the ability to dilute your 10% down to almost nothing, without ever having to ask your permission first. If new shares get issued under this new class, structured the right way, your original 10% could shrink to a fraction of a percent of the company's actual value, even though the number on paper, 10%, never technically changes. Who filed it? I asked, though some cold, settled part of me already suspected. Priscilla turned to the signature page. Salvatore Marchetti, she said, as managing member, dated 8 months ago. I sat back, feeling something in my chest, twist in a direction I hadn't braced for. Salvatore did this? To me? I don't think so, Priscilla said carefully. And I want to be honest with you about why. I pulled the notarization record attached to this filing. The notary's stamp is from a title company, 2 hours outside the city, one that doesn't have any other connection to Marchetti's or to Salvatore's usual attorney. I called them this morning. She paused. They have no record of Salvatore Marchetti ever appearing in their office, not 8 months ago, not ever. The room went very quiet. Someone forged this, I said slowly. I believe so, Priscilla said. And 8 months ago is a significant window. Odalise Gears. That's roughly when Salvatore's health started declining more seriously, according to what you've told me. It's also, I'd guess, around the time someone realized he might not live long enough to see how the will played out, and decided to make sure that whatever the will said, your equity stake wouldn't matter much by the time anyone read it. I thought about the last months of Salvatore's life, how tired he'd seemed, how much more he'd started leaning on Dominic to help out, with paperwork he used to handle entirely himself, always framing it as Dominic finally stepping up, finally taking an interest. I had been relieved at the time. I had thought, foolishly, that it was a good sign, father and son reconciling over something that mattered. Dominic, I said. I can't prove that yet, Priscilla said, but I think we both know where to start looking. If this amendment is forged, it's not just a civil matter anymore. Forging a legal document, submitting it to a state registry, using a fraudulent notarization, that's fraud, potentially criminal fraud, and if Dominic orchestrated it while his father was too ill to properly oversee the company's filings, that's the kind of thing that doesn't just cost him a restaurant. She closed the folder gently. It could cost him everything he thinks, that dismissal call already secured. My phone buzzed on the table between us, an email notification sliding across the screen. I glanced down, expecting nothing more than a delivery update or a condolence message I hadn't yet had the strength to open. It was from an address I didn't recognize, subject line simple and unadorned. I think you should see this before Monday. I opened the email standing in Priscilla's doorway, still half-turned toward the parking lot, and I read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. It was from Renee Castellano, Marchetti's longtime bookkeeper, a woman who had quietly balanced the restaurant's books for 15 years and never once, in all that time, involved herself in anything beyond spreadsheets and quarterly filings. Her message was short. I heard what happened at the funeral. I've kept quiet about a lot over the years because it wasn't my business. This feels like it is now. Attached were 3 scanned documents. I sat back down across from Priscilla without a word and turned my phone so she could see the screen too. The first document was an email chain between Dominic and a title company 2 hours outside the city, the same one Priscilla had already identified as having no record of Salvatore ever visiting. In it, Dominic asked, 8 months earlier, whether they could expedite a notarization for an elderly client with mobility issues, and offered to bring the documents to them personally, along with his father's ID, since Dad isn't up for the drive. "There it is," Priscilla said quietly. "He didn't bring Salvatore, he brought Salvatore's identification." The second document was a text exchange between Dominic and someone saved in his phone, only as R, dated around the same time, in which Dominic wrote, "Just need this cleaned up before anything happens to him. Odalise doesn't need to know until it's already done." The reply, from R, was a single word: "Understood." I felt my hands go cold around the phone. Who's R? Priscilla was already scrolling to the third document. I think that's about to answer itself. The third file was a scanned invoice from a small accounting and notary services firm, made out not to Dominic personally, but to Marchetti's LLC, for administrative filing assistance, paid from the restaurant's own operating account 8 months earlier. The invoice was signed by the firm's owner, Raymond Castellano, Renee's husband, Priscilla said slowly, understanding arriving in her voice at the same moment it arrived in mine. She must have found the invoice going through the restaurant's books after Salvatore passed. Recognized her own husband's signature on something he had no business being paid for out of Marchetti's account. She looked up at me. "This isn't just Dominic's carelessness anymore, Odalise. This is Renee choosing, deliberately, to hand you evidence that implicates her own husband. That's not a small thing to do." I sat with that for a long moment, turning the phone over in my hands. I thought about all the small kindnesses Renee had shown me over the years, the coffee she'd leave on my desk during inventory season, the quiet way she'd cover for me during Nico's worst months without ever asking questions I hadn't invited her to ask. I understood, sitting there, that her email wasn't really about the money, or even entirely about Dominic. It was about a woman who had watched me build something with my hands for 9 years and couldn't stand by quietly while someone erased it with a forged signature and a convenient notary 2 hours out of town. "What do we do with this?" I asked. Priscilla was already pulling a legal pad toward her, writing quickly. "We have forgery, we have fraudulent notarization, and we have a clear paper trail showing Dominic paid for it out of the company's own funds, which means he used Marchetti's money to defraud a fellow equity holder of that same company. That's not just civil liability anymore. That's something a district attorney would take seriously." She looked up at me. "But before we go anywhere near that, I want to give you a choice, because there are 2 different paths from here, and they lead to very different places." "Tell me," I said. "We can go straight to the district attorney's office with this evidence and let the criminal process take its course. That's slower, and it's public, and it will almost certainly end with Dominic facing real charges." She set down her pen. "Or we can use what we have to force a private resolution, full restoration of your equity, likely more than your original 10%, given what he's exposed himself to, control over the direction of the restaurant restored to you as the person who's actually run it for 9 years, and Dominic quietly removed from any managing role, all without ever making this a headline, in a town where Marchetti's name still means something." She held my gaze steadily. "Both paths get you justice. They just cost different things, and I think you're the only person who can decide which cost is worth paying." I thought about Salvatore, about the wine he'd poured me the night I signed that first agreement, about the word he'd used for me at every holiday table for 9 years. Not employee. Right hand. "I want to see Dominic's face," I said quietly. "Before either one of us decides anything for me. I want to give him the chance I never got, the chance to tell the truth before it's forced out of him." Priscilla nodded slowly, reaching for her phone. "Then let's arrange a meeting, Monday, before he thinks he's already won." We arranged the meeting for Monday morning, the same day Dominic expected me to walk into Marchetti's for the last time and quietly collect a final check. Instead, I walked in 10 minutes early, before the restaurant opened, before any staff arrived, and sat down in the corner booth where Salvatore used to do the books by hand every Sunday night, a cup of espresso going cold beside him. Dominic arrived looking mildly surprised to see me there ahead of him, still wearing the easy, generous expression of a man who believed the hardest part of this conversation was already behind him. "I wanted to come by," he said, setting down his coffee. "Make sure things end on good terms. I really do appreciate everything you did here." "I appreciate that," I said. "Before I go, I wanted to ask you something about an amendment filed to the LLC 8 months ago. I watched his face change in real time, the practiced warmth draining out of it, the way color drains from something left too long in the sun. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, I said, and slid the folder Priscilla had prepared across the table, the same quiet, controlled gesture I imagine he'd used 100 times closing deals of his own. The notary who never met your father. The identification you brought without him, the invoice paid from this restaurant's own account to your friend Raymond for filing assistance nobody at Marchetti's actually requested. I let the silence sit the way I'd learned silence could, letting it do work words couldn't. I also have the text messages, Dominic, the ones where you told Raymond I didn't need to know until it was already done. He didn't reach for the folder. He stared at it, like it might still disappear if he simply refused to touch it. I can walk out of here right now, I said, and hand all of this to the district attorney and let you explain to a judge why you forged your dying father's signature to strip equity from the woman who ran his kitchen for 9 years while he was too ill to stop you. Or you can listen to what I actually want, because it isn't what you think. His jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet, which told me more than any protest would have. I don't want to destroy this restaurant, I said. Your father built something real here, and so did I, alongside him, one service at a time, for 9 years. I want my equity restored, not the diluted fraction your forgery tried to leave me, but a stake that actually reflects what I built. I want operational control of the kitchen, and the direction of this restaurant returned to me, formally, in writing, reviewed by my own attorney. And I want you removed as managing member, quietly, framed however you'd like to frame it to the rest of the family, as long as the paperwork says what it needs to say. I closed the folder. In exchange, none of this ever reaches a courtroom. Your choice, Dominic. But you have until Wednesday to decide, because after that, I stop being the reasonable person you assumed I'd always be. He sat with it for a long moment, and something in his face finally cracked into something closer to the truth than anything he'd said to me since the funeral. I didn't think you'd fight for it, he admitted quietly. I thought you'd just be grateful for the reference. I know, I said. That was always your mistake. He signed the restoration agreement 2 days later, in Priscilla's office, without a lawyer of his own present, because bringing one would have meant explaining why he needed one in the first place. I never took the story public. I never needed to. Marchetti's reopened under my full direction 6 weeks later, the same recipes, the same worn wooden tables, a small brass plaque near the kitchen door that hadn't been there before, engraved simply with Salvatore's name, and the words, "Some things are built, not given." I think about that 9 years often, the version of me who signed a simple agreement over a glass of homemade wine because some quiet instinct told her to ask for something in writing, long before she ever imagined she'd need it. My mother never told me dignity was the one inheritance nobody could contest. Salvatore did, in his own way, the night he poured that wine and told me 10% was real, that nobody could pretend it wasn't there. He was right. It just took 9 years, one funeral, and one very careful attorney to prove it. If Odalise's story gave you even a fraction of the satisfaction it gave me writing it, stay close. There's more where this came from, and subscribing means you'll never miss the next one.